You know, there's something we almost never talk about when we talk about resilience. We celebrate it. We put it on motivational posters. We tell people who are struggling, you're so strong, you'll bounce back. You've got this. And on the surface, that sounds like kindness. It sounds like support. But underneath that, there's something quietly damaging happening. And today I want to pull that apart with you, because the pressure to be resilient, the cultural obsession with bouncing back, is causing real psychological harm, and most people have no idea it's happening to them. Let me start by asking you something. Think about the last time something genuinely hard happened in your life. Maybe it was a breakup, a loss, a failure at work, something that shook you. Now think about how long you allowed yourself to actually feel that. And then think about when the internal voice kicked in, the one that said, okay, that's enough. Time to move on. Get yourself together. Be strong. Stop dwelling. Because that voice, that internal pressure, is what I want to talk about today. That voice is not wisdom. That voice is not resilience. That voice, more often than not, is a trauma response that we've collectively decided to call a virtue. The concept of resilience as we understand it today comes largely from developmental psychology. Researchers in the 1970s, studying children who grew up in incredibly difficult circumstances, poverty, abuse, family dysfunction, noticed that some of those children seemed to function well as adults. They seemed to cope, and the question became what made those children different, what gave them the ability to keep going, and that research was genuinely valuable. It helped us understand that human beings are not simply products of their worst circumstances. That context, relationships, community, self-perception, all of these things shape how we move through hardship. But somewhere between that careful, nuanced research and the culture we live in today, something went very wrong. Resilience got hijacked. It got turned into a personal virtue, almost a moral requirement. If you struggle, if you take too long to recover, if you need help, if you break down, somewhere in the cultural messaging you receive, there is an implication that you have failed at resilience, that you are weak, that you are not one of the strong ones. And that implication, subtle as it sometimes is, has enormous psychological consequences. Let's talk about what actually happens in the human nervous system when we experience loss or trauma or significant stress. Because this is where I think the conversation has to start, not with philosophy but with biology. When something painful happens, your brain and body have a set of evolved responses designed to help you survive that event. Your stress response activates. Cortisol floods your system. Your nervous system goes into a kind of emergency mode. And critically, these responses are not designed to resolve quickly. They are designed to keep you vigilant, to keep you oriented toward the threat, to make sure that you learn from what happened so that you can protect yourself in the future. Grief, for example, is not a malfunction. Grief is not you failing to cope. Grief is your nervous system doing exactly what it is supposed to do when you lose something that mattered deeply to you. The psychologist George Bonanno, who has done some of the most extensive research on grief and resilience, has found that most people do show what he calls natural resilience after loss, meaning they maintain relatively stable functioning. But he is also very clear that this does not mean they feel fine. It does not mean they do not suffer. And it absolutely does not mean that those who take longer to recover are psychologically weaker or more damaged. The problem is that we have taken the observation that some people cope and turned it into a prescription for how everyone should cope. And we've added a timeline to it. You should be over this by now. You should be moving forward. You should be finding the silver lining. And when people can't do that, when their nervous systems are still processing something real and significant, they start to feel ashamed of their own grief. They start to perform recovery rather than actually experiencing it. This is a concept called forced resilience, and I want you to really sit with this because it is far more common than most people realize. Forced resilience is what happens when you bypass the emotional processing that your nervous system actually needs in order to perform the functional, forward-moving version of yourself that society expects. You go back to work. You smile when people ask how you're doing. You say, "I'm fine, actually, I'm doing better." You start talking about what you learned from the experience. You focus on gratitude. And all of this looks like healing from the outside, and it might even feel like progress to you in the short term. Because numbness and avoidance can feel like strength when you're in survival mode. But the research on emotional processing is quite consistent. When we bypass grief, when we cut short the natural arc of emotional recovery, those unprocessed emotions don't disappear. They go somewhere. They get stored, not metaphorically, but in a very literal physiological sense. The body keeps a record of what the mind refuses to acknowledge. And over time, what presents as resilience on the surface begins to manifest as chronic low-grade anxiety, as emotional numbness, as a kind of flatness in life where things that should bring joy don't quite land the way they used to. Sometimes it shows up as physical symptoms, headaches, chronic fatigue, digestive issues, the body speaking a language that the mind is not allowed to speak. This is not a new idea, but it is one that keeps getting drowned out by the relentless cultural messaging around strength and forward momentum. The psychoanalytic tradition has known for over a century that what is not processed consciously tends to express itself in other ways. And contemporary neuroscience, through the work of researchers like Bessel van der Kolk and Peter Levine, has given us a much more detailed picture of how unprocessed emotional experience is stored in the body and in the nervous system, and what it costs us over time. Now, I want to be really careful here because I am not saying that resilience is a bad thing. I am not saying that coping is bad. I am not saying that you should wallow indefinitely or that recovery is impossible or undesirable. What I'm saying is that there is a fundamental difference between genuine resilience, the kind that comes from actually moving through pain, and performed resilience, the kind that comes from suppressing it. And our culture has enormous difficulty distinguishing between these two things because one of them looks like strength and one of them looks like weakness, even though psychologically, they are almost the opposite. Genuine resilience is not the absence of suffering. It is not bouncing back quickly. Genuine resilience is actually the capacity to feel difficult things fully and then continue living. It includes the ability to ask for help. It includes the ability to fall apart and then slowly, with support and time, to find your footing again. Psychologists sometimes call this post-traumatic growth, the phenomenon where people who go through genuinely hard experiences emerge with a deeper understanding of themselves and of what matters. And the research on post-traumatic growth is consistent in one important finding. It requires actually processing the experience. It requires letting the experience change you. The people who show the deepest, most lasting growth after adversity are not the ones who recovered the fastest. They are the ones who allowed themselves to be genuinely affected. Let me tell you about something that happens in therapy rooms with remarkable regularity. A person comes in, maybe they've been struggling for a year, maybe longer, maybe they've been carrying something heavy. And very often, within the first few sessions, they say something like, "I know I should be over this by now. I know other people have been through worse. I feel like I'm being weak." And what's so striking about this is not just the self-judgment, it's the internalization of an external standard. Somewhere along the way, this person absorbed a message about how long recovery should take, about what strength looks like, and they are now using that external standard to punish themselves for having a completely normal human response to difficulty. The therapist's job in that moment is not to reassure the person that they're fine. It's to help them understand where that standard came from and to question it. Because the standard of rapid resilience, of bouncing back, of not letting things affect you too much, is not a psychological truth. It is a cultural artifact. It is, in many cases, a product of economic systems that require people to be productive, to be functional, to keep showing up regardless of what they're going through internally. We don't give people enough time to grieve. We don't give people enough space to struggle. And then when they can't recover on the timeline that productivity demands, we tell them it's a personal failure. There's also something worth examining about who resilience gets celebrated in and who it gets demanded from. Research has consistently shown that the expectation of emotional stoicism, of not showing pain, of getting back up quickly, is disproportionately applied to certain groups. Men, in particular, receive tremendous cultural pressure to perform emotional invulnerability. The psychological cost of this is well documented. Men are less likely to seek help, less likely to talk about emotional pain, and significantly more likely to experience the consequences of unprocessed grief and trauma in the form of addiction, physical health problems, and tragically in suicidal behavior. The message that strength means not needing support is not just unhelpful, it is genuinely dangerous. And it's not only men, people from certain cultural backgrounds, people in positions of leadership, parents, particularly mothers, who receive constant messaging that their own emotional needs are secondary. First responders, healthcare workers, anyone whose social role is defined by being there for others. All of these people carry an additional layer of expectation around resilience, an additional layer of cultural pressure to be fine, and it comes at a significant psychological cost. I want to introduce a concept here that I think is really useful: the window of tolerance. This is a term developed by the psychiatrist Dan Siegel, and it describes the optimal zone of nervous system arousal, the zone in which you can function, process information, feel emotions, and engage with others without being overwhelmed or shutting down. When you're inside the window of tolerance, you can handle stress, You can feel difficult things and think clearly at the same time. But when something is too much, when the stress is too great, you move outside that window. You might go into hyperarousal, which looks like anxiety, panic, rage, reactivity, or you might go into hypoarousal, which looks like numbness, dissociation, flatness, withdrawal, depression. Here's the thing about forced resilience. When we push ourselves to recover before we're ready, when we suppress the emotional processing that our nervous system needs, we are often pushing ourselves into hypoarousal. We are pushing ourselves into that numb, dissociated, flat zone and calling it strength. And from the outside, it can look very convincing. The person is functioning. They're showing up. They're not crying in public. They're talking about moving on. But inside the nervous system, something very different is happening. The capacity for genuine emotional engagement has gone offline. The richness of life has diminished. And often, people in this state don't even realize what they've lost. Because numbness, by its very nature, makes it hard to feel the absence. Recovery, real recovery, often requires going back. It requires revisiting. It requires, at some point, sitting with the thing that hurt and letting it be what it was. This is why avoidance, even when it's sophisticated and socially sanctioned avoidance, is effective. Dressed up in the language of resilience and moving forward, tends to prolong suffering rather than resolve it. The research on anxiety is very instructive here. One of the most well-established findings in clinical psychology is that avoidance maintains anxiety. When we avoid the thing that scares us or hurts us, we send a signal to our nervous system that the thing is so dangerous it cannot be approached. And the nervous system responds by keeping us in a heightened state of vigilance around it, even when we think we've moved past it. The same principle applies to grief and to trauma. What we avoid, we carry. What we sit with, we can eventually integrate. Integration doesn't mean the pain disappears. It means it stops running your life from a place outside your awareness. It means the memory of what happened becomes something you can hold, rather than something that holds you. So what does this mean practically? What do we do with this? I think the first thing, the most important thing, is to give yourself permission to not be fine. This sounds almost embarrassingly simple, but I want you to take it seriously, because the permission to not be fine is genuinely radical in a culture that is constantly asking you to perform wellness. It means allowing yourself to feel what you actually feel, on your own timeline, without measuring yourself against some external standard of recovery. It means treating your own emotional process with the same patience and respect you would offer someone you love. It also means being skeptical of narratives around silver linings and lessons, learned in everything happening for a reason, at least in the acute phase of pain. These narratives are not inherently harmful, and many people find genuine meaning through difficulty. But when they are imposed from the outside, when they function as a way of rushing someone through grief, or when you impose them on yourself as a way of bypassing pain, they can actually prevent the deeper processing that real integration requires. Meaning-making is something that happens over time, through the actual experience of moving through something hard. It is not a shortcut around the hard thing. The second thing I want to suggest is about the role of other people. We do not recover in isolation. This is one of the clearest findings in trauma psychology. Connection is not a nice supplement to recovery. It is a biological requirement for it. Our nervous systems are co-regulatory, meaning they genuinely regulate each other in relationship. When you are with a safe person, a person whose nervous system is calm and present, your own nervous system begins to settle. When you are held, metaphorically or literally, by someone who is not frightened by your pain, your capacity to process that pain increases significantly. This means that one of the most important things you can do when you are struggling is not to have everything figured out, not to present yourself as coping, not to protect other people from your pain. It is to let yourself be seen, to reach for connection, to allow someone to be present with you in the difficulty rather than managing it alone. This is not weakness. This is, from a neurobiological standpoint, one of the most adaptive things a human being can do, and it also means being that person for others. Being someone who doesn't panic when the people you care about are not okay. Being someone who can sit with pain without immediately trying to fix it or reframe it or rush it toward resolution. The capacity to witness another person's suffering without running from it is an enormous gift. It is, in many ways, the foundation of genuine healing. I want to spend a few minutes on something that I think complicates all of this in interesting ways: the relationship between resilience and identity. For many people, the belief that they are resilient, that they cope well, that they handle things, is deeply woven into their sense of who they are. And this can make genuine processing very difficult, because allowing yourself to really fall apart, to admit that something has profoundly affected you, can feel like a threat to your identity. It can feel like losing yourself. If I have always been the strong one, the one who handles things, the one people turn to, then allowing myself to be genuinely undone by something is not just uncomfortable, it can feel existentially threatening. And so people in this position often engage in enormous psychological effort to maintain the performance of strength. And the cost of that effort, the sheer energy it takes to hold the performance together, is itself a form of suffering that often goes completely unrecognized. There's also something worth noting about the relationship between resilience and control. For many people, the drive to recover quickly, to bounce back, to not be affected, is fundamentally about control. If I can manage my emotional response, if I can contain it and move through it on my own timeline, then I have some control over an experience that was perhaps profoundly uncontrollable. And control, in the wake of something traumatic or painful, is genuinely precious. I want to honor that. The impulse toward control after loss or trauma is completely understandable. It is a way of restoring a sense of safety in a world that has just demonstrated its capacity to hurt you. But there is a paradox here, and it is one that shows up again and again in psychological work with people who are struggling. The attempt to control emotional experience, to manage and contain and move through it on your own terms, often prevents the very thing you're trying to achieve. Because real emotional resolution, real integration, requires a degree of surrender. Not surrender to defeat, not giving up, but a willingness to feel what you feel without immediately trying to shape it or manage it or speed it up. The capacity to be in uncertainty, to not know how long this will take, to not know what you will be on the other side of it, is actually central to genuine recovery. And this is where things get philosophically interesting, because what we're really talking about, underneath all of this, is the question of how we relate to our own suffering. Do we treat it as a problem to be solved, a weakness to be overcome, a malfunction to be corrected, or do we treat it as information, as part of the full range of human experience, as something that, when met with presence and patience and compassion, can eventually teach us something about ourselves and about what we value and about what it means to be alive? I think the cultural obsession with resilience is, at its root, an inability to sit with the second of those framings. We are deeply uncomfortable with suffering, both our own and other people's. We want to fix it. We want to rush it. We want to extract lessons from it as quickly as possible so we can get back to the business of being fine. And there is something understandable about that. Suffering is uncomfortable. Watching someone you love suffer is uncomfortable. We reach for solutions because reaching for solutions is how we express care. But the reaching, the rushing, the fixing, when it happens too quickly, when it doesn't first allow for genuine acknowledgement of what has happened and what it means and what it costs, that rushing is not kindness. It is, however well-intentioned, a form of abandonment, a message that says, your pain is too much, your timeline is too long, your suffering is inconvenient, get it together. And the person receiving that message, even when it's wrapped in genuine love and concern, often internalizes it and adds it to the burden they're already carrying. So here is what I want you to take away from all of this. Real resilience, the kind that actually sustains you, that actually allows you to live a full life after difficulty, does not look like not being affected. It does not look like bouncing back quickly. It does not look like performing strength or offering silver linings on demand. Real resilience looks like knowing when you need help and asking for it. It looks like allowing yourself to feel what you feel without punishing yourself for how long it takes. It looks like staying in relationship with others even when you are not at your best. And it looks like trusting, even when you can't feel it yet, that moving through pain is possible, not around it, not above it, through it. Stop measuring your recovery against a cultural standard that was never built with your nervous system in mind. Stop performing strength for people who haven't earned the right to witness your vulnerability. And stop confusing the absence of visible pain with health. Because some of the most suffering people I have ever encountered are the ones who look, from the outside, like they have it most together. Healing is not a performance. It is a process. It is slow. It is nonlinear. It is often ugly and confusing and uncertain. And it is also, when you allow it to unfold on its own terms, one of the most profound things a human being can go through, not in spite of the difficulty, but because of it. Because something in you is being asked to expand, to stretch, to become someone who can hold more than you could before. And that expansion does not happen in spite of the pain. It happens through the willingness to meet it honestly. That is what resilience actually is, not the refusal to fall apart, but the willingness eventually to put yourself back together with full knowledge of what broke you, and the quiet understanding that the breaking was also part of becoming who you are.